So hello there and welcome to another episode of the DNF1 F1 podcast. My name is Adam Burns, I'm your co-host for this week's episode, and joining me is not Courtney Pine. Courtney is away on a lovely little vacation out in the country, so when he listens to this, Courtney, hope you are doing well and enjoying your holiday. It will be great to have you back next week. But in his place, joining us, first time guest on this show, is a good friend of mine who knows his stuff about Formula One, so I'm sure he'll be able to provide excellent analysis on this week's topics. It's Lee Wallington. So Lee, welcome on the show. First time with us with DNF1. How are you today?
Firstly, I'll say thank you for having me, but I'm good today. Just obviously sweltering in the heat today, but I think the drivers and the cars sold in the heat today as well, so I'm not alone in that.
Yes, absolutely roasting this weekend here in the UK. Temperatures are up to low to mid 30s, and of course that's also transpired and affected this Grand Prix action, and that's where it leads us. First things first, the F1 70th anniversary Grand Prix. Bit of a mouthful, certainly won't be the most difficult Grand Prix name to pronounce this season, with Mugello of course coming up. What Ferrari have in store to call that, God only knows. But what a Grand Prix, and I think first things firstly, I've got to say, thank God for Red Bull and Max Verstappen. What a performance from them. Max Verstappen recording his first win of the season, his 9th in his career in Formula One. I was going to say short career, but he's been around for quite some time. Still a very, very young man, but absolutely fantastic performance from Max Verstappen, and Red Bull really ruffling Mercedes' feathers and getting the win on a very historic Grand Prix weekend. How was it for you, Lee? What did you think of the race?
Oh, well, I think the race was a stonker. I got to admit, before the lights went out, I was like, oh, this is going to be a Mercedes counter. Hamilton will try out strategy, Bottas, and because it's the same team and the leading driver takes priority, it's going to be a Bottas win. But I did not expect Mercedes, as they did, and Red Bull to come at them, and even after the stop, to have a stronger pace on older tyres. And obviously there was always a variable Verstappen on his harder tyres, but I did not expect it to play out in the fashion it did.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And I think the strategy was key. We all expected, with the change in tyres for Pirelli, of course, they planned to bring one level softer compound tyres to this weekend's race, in contrast to last weekend's race at the British Grand Prix at the same venue, to try and spice up the action. Of course, they wanted to avoid a copy and paste of last week's results, and we certainly did not get that at all. We certainly got what seemed doable, but I think given how dominant Mercedes have been early on in the season, it just seemed very, very unlikely. But if anybody was going to topple them and really get on top of them today, it was definitely going to be Max Verstappen. And it was some special driver, of course, the famous moment in the race, very, very early on, during the opening stint on the harder tyres, the Red Bull team telling Max, we need to back off from the Mercedes to build a bit of a gap behind them so that we can keep the tyres cool, make them last a bit longer, because, of course, those of you new to Formula One need to, well, sorry, I should say that again. get my words twisted there. Those of you new to Formula One may not know that when you're following close to the car behind, all of that hot air really disturbs the tyres and really causes them to heat up, which makes them slide. It makes your cornering speeds a lot lower, and of course wears them out faster. So obviously the aim was to preserve the tyre life, to perhaps give them more options later in the race. But Max responded quite amazingly by saying, mate, this is the only chance of being close to the Mercedes. I'm not going to just sit there behind like a grandma. And, Max basically took it on him to stay with the Mercedes, which he very much did, put them under pressure. And from what we saw last week's race, Lee, Mercedes really struggled to handle the tyres, especially in the hot, sweltering conditions.
Oh, yeah, it's, they've already proven when they're in Austria. I can't remember off the top of my head, it was the Austrian or the Styrian Grand Prix, where on the practice sessions it was really hot and Mercedes seemed to be nowhere in the practice with the heat. And it's been an Achilles for them over the last several seasons, actually, with the heat and how they use their tyres in heat. They probably have improved their performance. So they probably went into the Grand Prix with slight worries in technical meetings before the race, but I'm sure they never imagined it to go as bad as it did.
Yeah, and what was worrying is that at the start of the second stint, after Mercedes had both made their pit stops onto the harder tyres, they were struggling and graining on those tyres for the opening few laps. It almost as if they were already developing blisters. Again, those of you new to the sport, graining and blistering, basically when there's too much load going on the tyres early on, and it causes them to lose that initial bit of grip. But of course, the idea is that if you clean up your tyres as the stint progresses, some of that grip will come back to you as the tyre life starts to wear down. But in Mercedes' case, they were already struggling the moment they put those tyres on into the next stint. And Max was able to make those hard tyres last quite a long time. I think he ended up doing 27 laps on that opening stint. And that proved to be the key factor because he was still pulling away from the Mercedes. He was still lapping at a very good pace. If anything, Mercedes were slower than even Charles Leclerc at times in as the stint sort of progressed on, who did an excellent job for Ferrari, but of course we'll get into that. But then of course as the race unfolded, they both ended up pitting again, although at different periods, and Max was able to have another pit stop and stay ahead of both the mercs to take an absolutely fantastic win. And it's got to be said, Lee, the main issue in Formula One at the moment is that we have a team like Mercedes that are so dominant, so brilliant, with a partnership with Hamilton and Bottas, and Lewis Hamilton especially, as brilliant as he has been. We've almost been forgiven for thinking that they are the formidable force at the moment and that nobody can topple them. But it brings that same old argument again to the surface, that with a driver as talented and as quickly maturing as Max Verstappen is in his racecraft, the question remains, how long will Max stay at Red Bull? How long will it be before Max can finally be in a car that can go toe-to-toe with Lewis Hamilton and Mercedes on a week-by-week basis? Because it's been a long time and he produces these performances, but we want to see this every week from Max. We know he's got it, but we need to see him have that car behind him.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I know Max has signed up for Red Bull for a couple more seasons. I can't remember the exact number, but he's probably putting all his hopes on the regulation change for 2022, and really hoping that Adrian Newey can do his magic and bring the Red Bull back to the front as per the regulation change of for 2010. But if that doesn't happen, I'm sure Joss will be speaking to Max about where to look, and even if Mercedes get it wrong and there's another dominant force that gets it right, which I'm sure, even if Mercedes get it wrong, there will be a dominant force. There always is after a regulation change. But Max will be looking elsewhere because he's already getting impatient, and as you said, he's not going to wait around for Red Bull to get it right eventually.
Yeah, and it's absolutely right. And we should mention, obviously, when you mention Jos, you mean Jos Verstappen, Max's father. Yeah, the big Jos the boss, Verstappen. Former Formula One driver himself, great performances in the old Jaguar team, in the Arrows team, and of course a brief stint in Formula E as well, before he took into full permanent retirement. But yeah, that's an absolutely good point that you've made, Lee, that Max is in that position. I believe it's till 2023 he signed that long-term deal with Red Bull a few years ago, and since then he has been made Red Bull's golden boy, much like Sebastian Vettel was, as you quite rightly pointed out, in the early 2010s when he went 4 years in a row winning championships. That's the level Red Bull want to get to, and they certainly have a driver in Max that is world championship potential. I don't think there's anyone that knows anything about Formula One that would disagree with that opinion, but he's never had the car to go toe-to-toe with the best of the best week in, week out. He's always had a car that's capable of winning the odd race weekend, and especially in his hands, I'm of the opinion that there's probably no one else on the grid, perhaps bar Lewis Hamilton, or maybe a push Leclerc, but that's a big push even then, that could possibly do what Max did today under the circumstances. And that creates its own problems for Red Bull. Whilst we both agree that Max would be better off staying at Red Bull themselves know that they will only stay at the very top of the sport for as long as they can still attract the big drivers, as good as their car can be. And amazing enough, they're a team that for a long time have been known as the big kings of developing a car throughout the season. So why is it, Lee, if I can ask you this, why is it when Red Bull are so good at developing their car throughout the season, why is it they always seem to struggle to bring a championship winning car from day one since the turbo hybrid era started.
Well, I think could be the cause of what's happening, and obviously this is just my opinion, is Adrian Newey, so Master Genius, says he's designing cars, and he has obviously brought the Red Bull into the high rake concept, and that's been developed. But every year, well, I shouldn't say probably every year, but probably every other year, there's been a slight adjustment to the rules and what can be permissible as aerodynamic devices on the car, of the slots in the floor, the little winglets, obviously the flexible front wing of a couple of years ago, and things like that. And so every time there's a little adjustment, then where the Red Bull, by the end of the previous season, is a perfect balance of harmony of its aerodynamic capabilities. That little adjustment, even with all the CFD you can do, which is obviously limited, and then your wind tunnel test, which is obviously limited, it will never find the inconsistencies that you turn up on test day in Barcelona, and especially the first Grand Prix. So they get those inconsistencies and they tweak it, and then they find something else and they tweak it, and by the end of the season, that's all sorted, and their aerodynamics is a nice, beautiful Red Bull, which is, as you said, over previous seasons, you see the Red Bull always comes out stronger towards the end of the year. But then something changes that ruins that harmony that they develop, even if it's not just an aerodynamic device, it's the tyres change, and obviously if the tyres change and their dynamics work great for the previous season, but they don't want the tyres correctly, they have another problem. Obviously this year the tyres have stayed the same as last year, although Pirelli weren't very happy with that. The teams voted the new tyres down. There's just those inconsistencies that Red Bull at the top of their game with the blown diffuser really helped solidify any gaps in their armoury that I think they're missing.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point, and you're absolutely right. Of course, when they design these cars, or when they run them through the bench testing, the dyno testing, the CFD testing that you've mentioned at the factories, they always sort of shoot for a target number, if you like, to sort of, this is how fast we think we can make this car, this is what we're shooting for. And of course, they measure that with all the data they have in the factory, and then obviously they compare that with the sensors when they go out on testing, doing pre-season on the track. As we saw, and Red Bull looked very competitive in pre-season testing. It looked like they had a car capable that could challenge Mercedes, but we'll never know if Red Bull were able to turn up to Melbourne before COVID set in and postponed the season for a good 4 months. If Red Bull could compete with Mercedes, we won't know. Mercedes and Red Bull both brought upgrades, as did other teams in the off-season, and they were able to build an advantage that they have. And Red Bull, until today, haven't had an answer. Nobody has. So it is quite the head-scratcher, but Red Bull in a position now where they'll be rallying from this win. They'll be optimistic that there is a car capable of getting the odd win this season, but they've got to find a way to be able to produce a car that can really get going from the start. And maybe 2022, as you pointed out, Lee, maybe that's the earliest opportunity in which they'll be able to do that. But that does increase the pressure in order to retain someone like Max Verstappen, because he's going to be a champion whether he does it at Red Bull or somewhere else. So, yeah, so there's a lot of pressure on that. But of course, with that win for Max Verstappen, takes him up to second in the Drivers' Championship behind Lewis Hamilton. Lewis, of course, increasing his margin now to, well, it's actually stayed at 30 points, but this time Max Verstappen is now second ahead of Valtteri Bottas. And I think we have to talk a little bit about between the two of them at Mercedes now, because of course, whilst we know Mercedes claim, and I strongly emphasise the word claim, that they allow their drivers to race when the opportunity is suitable. Today, I believe, is the first time this season we actually got to see an opportunity where both guys were able to race. And they said it on the radio, both drivers, they warned Bottas that they've allowed Lewis to race him. But the issue at hand is that with Bottas in the situation he's in right now, he's just signed a new contract Mercedes for 2021, so he's got that in his pocket. He doesn't have to worry about his future, at least for next year. But do you think it was a good decision for Mercedes under the circumstances where they pitted Bottas 10 laps earlier to cover Verstappen off, or try to cover Verstappen off, which they didn't do, and allowed Hamilton to have that advantage of much, much fresher rubber later on, to a point where he overtook Bottas with relative ease, considering the battle those two are supposed to be having in the championship. Do you think that was a fair move for Mercedes, or do you think perhaps that they should have told both their cars to hold station under the circumstances, because they weren't exactly raced on equal terms?
Yeah, I agree. They weren't racing on equal terms, but I think the way Mercedes have tried to operate since Nico Rosberg left at the end of 2016, and the disharmony that Rosberg and Hamilton had between themselves, and the disharmony brought between both sides of the garage. Even back then, they operated on a non-bias policy, and they were equal drivers. But there were times that one side of the garage were trying to outmove the other side of the garage. So Mercedes have really tried since then to try and force a fair playing field from senior management onto the garage, and for the most part it's worked. I mean, Mercedes are more successful now than they were 2016. All right, they've won, but by their actual margin, I think, has increased by their constructors' points since Bottas has joined the team. But I think it's been proven many times that when Mercedes are great at, this is our strategy, we're going to go win the race, well done, boys. When the strategy doesn't go right, Mercedes have really struggled, I think, on their feet. And this is something where Red Bull is really good at, is thinking on their feet when it comes to the strategy. Not always, because Red Bull have got it wrong, every team gets it wrong, but Red Bull more often than not go for the riskier strategy, they think on their feet, and when the race changes, they'd adapt to it a lot quicker than Mercedes can. So I think with Bottas, they were sticking to their strategy, going, okay, the tyres are graining, we need to go in again. Red Bull really don't know their strategy. They were just doing that short stint, or they just followed and decided to just bring Verstappen in, because they could see the Mercedes engineers out in the pit lane. They were just going to shadow and mirror the Mercedes strategy, because they already had track position. But I think Mercedes panicked a bit. There seemed to be a discussion that they try and force Hamilton to do a one-stop, which, based on what happened last week, and he's the championship leader, I don't even know why they even consider that, because I don't think the tyres would have lasted. And even if Hamilton wanted to stay out to the end, and by the sounds of what was going on, he didn't. So I think that's delayed it, because they were having that conversation. Obviously, from the radio and the broadcast, they'd explicitly say, stay out, we're trying to get to the end, but that's what was being applied from the radio snippets we could hear. So I think that wasted a few times, and then a few laps, and then I think they then decided on the lap delta to try and get a victory and not care about Bottas. We can still get a victory, get a massive lap delta, and when Hamilton came out, he was lapping, I think it was 2 seconds faster than Bottas, and probably 1.5 seconds, or maybe a bit less than Verstappen, which, considering was about 11 seconds when he came out, and then there was 12 laps. At that point, it was very possible Hamilton could have been chasing Verstappen. So for the race win, Mercedes sacrificed Bottas. It didn't work out, but that's what I think.
Yeah, it was one of those.
Happened.
It was one of those interesting situations where, as the stint was going on for Lewis, I kind of thought to myself, that experience he had winning the race on free wheels last week might prove invaluable to him, because the way his race was going, it seemed like he was going to be in that position again. I mean, his tyres were graining for such a long time, and in my mind, it seemed like Mercedes were keeping Lewis out because they felt that a safety car could happen, and if it did, it would not necessarily give him the lead, because Verstappen had enough of a buffer to take it back, even under safety car delta, but Lewis would have had much fresher rubber and would have been all over the back of Max and Valtteri Bottas most likely, and Charles Leclerc, of course, he had to pass him too, in order to get that win. So I think that's what Mercedes were going for, and I think they just made that executive decision, as you said, to sacrifice one car's race to at least make sure that the other one could win. And whilst that's all fine and well, both of your guys are fighting for a world championship, and it's not going to sit well with the guy that previously, up till now, has not really ruffled any feathers within the team. He's been very good, he's been very calm, very helpful. He's not proved to be as conflicting of a teammate as Nico Rosberg was with Lewis Hamilton when they were together, and it was absolute fireworks for the best part of 3 years, which culminated eventually in Rosberg winning the 2016 World Championship. I think it's fair to say, as good as Bottas has been in previous years, I don't personally consider him to be World Championship material, especially against someone like Lewis Hamilton. Maybe that's a bit harsh, but it just...
I would agree.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, a stats rose up this week. I don't know if you noticed, Lee, on social media, that Nico Rosberg, since 2016, has won more races for Mercedes than Valtteri Bottas. And Bottas has been in that car for the last 4 years or so, since Rosberg left Mercedes. So it's not a good sight if you are a Valtteri Bottas fan. But of course, Valtteri won't give up. He's very persistent and tenacious, and I'm sure he'll keep fighting to the very end. But right now, very much advantage Lewis Hamilton at Mercedes. Moving on from, obviously, Mercedes licking their wounds and Red Bull rolling in their success of a monumental day for them, we move on to Ferrari, who had a very contrasting day. Once again, Charles Leclerc absolutely putting in a stellar performance. It's the 4th position for him today. Of course, he was running in 4th last week before Valtteri Bottas had the tyre problems which promoted him into the podium. Not so much luck today, but considering where Charles Leclerc had qualified in, I believe it was 8th position, Ferrari looked like any sort of advantage that they may have had last week had completely evaporated. But Charles' race pace and also completing the one-stop strategy, I think he was the only person that did do a one-stopper today. And
I think there was 2 other drivers.
2 others.
3 in total.
Actually, I know you're right. I'm actually looking through this now, and yes, so it was Leclerc, Ocon did a one-stopper, and also Raikkonen. Yeah, so thank you for pointing that out. Yeah, but all things considered, a very impressive drive once again from Charles Leclerc. Are we starting to see, perhaps in a season where Ferrari are going to be taking the positives from anything that they can and hoping to come back stronger, maybe not next season, but certainly the year after, are we starting to see in these circumstances a driver like Charles Leclerc that can challenge for world championships in the future with the likes of Max Verstappen and Lewis Hamilton?
I would believe so. I mean, in a good car or in a great car, a good driver can win. But in a bad car, a great driver, when given the opportunity, can win. Not that I'm saying that's why you're going to win this season, but 4th place, a one-place strategy when he's working successfully, he's 4-time world champion, teammate spinning on after the first corner, and pushing out of the points. Leclerc is showing the hallmarks of having obviously a trial year, but he's putting out. He's already pulled out a couple of great drives this year, and another great driver being doing a one-stop in the heat. And I don't know if the Ferraris were blistering, but considering only 3 drivers out of the 20 did it successfully. Right, you save the time for not doing the extra pit stop, but you have to obviously drive a lot slower to not overuse your tyres. Obviously, I don't know what would have been the quicker delta, but I know Ferrari are running such light downforce to try and make up their differential with their top speeds, because obviously the loss of horsepower.
That's right, yeah.
So they're not putting as much downforce through the tyre load, so maybe that helped, but then you always can measure yourself by your teammate, and Vettel's been nowhere this year, and once again, nowhere again. So I definitely agree this is, if anything, Leclerc's coming out this year a much stronger driver, and when given the opportunity, when Ferrari do give the right car, he's going to be, like he was last year, be right up there with Verstappen.
Well, it's
and fighting Hamilton.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite intriguing because he's in a very unique position this season where, whilst Ferrari are literally being read the right act by the Italian press and the Italian fan base that they so often shine in front of, it must be said, in history of Formula One, there's no team like Ferrari. But because of the fact that Ferrari have struggled, early on this season. We know that their car is nowhere near what it was last season in terms of pace relative to the rest of the field. Of course, the fallout from the engine controversy, which of course we don't know the details of what the FIA found, but we know they must have found something, because the compromise was that Ferrari had to sort their engine out, and they've lost as much as 60 brake horsepower as a result, which is a massive amount in Formula 1. I mean, we talk about cars with over 1,000 brake horsepower, but even as much as 60 makes a huge difference for a car on the top speed. And you're right to point out, of course, Ferrari made adjustments to both their cars. They tried to run less downforce on both cars, where Charles adjusted his driving to really get the best out of it, not just last week, but this week as well. Probably maybe more impressive drive this week under the circumstances of tyre management as well. And where he has shone and growing in stature, Sebastian Vettel once again falling away. And of course, he was on the right strategy to start on the hard tyres, go long, and maybe go on to the mediums towards the end if he could make them last. But he spun after turn one, as he's unfortunately become quite infamous for. Another spin, of course, he lost control where the car got a bit loose, going over the curbs into turn one as he went off the throttle, and he just wasn't able to control it. And he got sent into a spin, fortunately not to get hit, tried to recover his race. But I think the key element in this race for Sebastian is that he did show some performance as the race went on. But unfortunately, the strategy Ferrari had adjusted for him really put him into a lot of traffic behind the likes of Ocon, Ricciardo, Norris, Sainz, and also the AlphaTauris as well. And it just left him in a precarious position where he was very angry at his team over it. He basically said, I'm quoting a radio message Sebastian laid out during the race, saying, "It is in the gap that we didn't like. We spoke about it this morning. I'll hang in there, but you know that you've messed up." Now, given Vettel's comments on the radio, or lack of comments on the radio following the races, and once again, I think I'm right in saying that he actually didn't respond at all this time. So they usually have the radio message at the end of the race, and last week his engineer was on the radio to him. Vettel didn't respond at first until Mattia Binotto came on, the team principal Ferrari, to do a radio check with Seb, where Vettel did respond. Very much down in the dumps, but this week absolutely nothing. And it's got to be said, for a four-time world champion that has won so many races, only Hamilton and Michael Schumacher have won more. For a driver as illustrious as a career as Sebastian Vettel has had, he is not in the right headspace right now, Lee. Would you say that's probably fair to say?
Yeah, I think he's suffering outside the car. I think he's hurting from the way Ferrari have treated him regarding how it's come out, with how he wasn't even offered a new contract, and how that was found out in the media come the first race. And I think he's hurting, and he's completely lost trust in the team. And when you don't have trust in the team, you're obviously not going to have trust in the car, and he just doesn't feel welcome or supported. And I think Sebastian is very much a man that needs the love and the support to be in his perfect place. And we saw it in his Red Bull days, when Christian Horner were given that support and the team was moulded around him. He would be quite amazing in some of the drives he performed. But you could argue he's never had that with Ferrari, but this year especially, he's definitely not got that at all, and it's just going to be a horrible, miserable season for Sebastian Vettel this year. That's what I think. I think it's just like a divorce is just going to get messier and messier as this year goes on.
Yeah, so you don't have to worry about the kids and where they go in the settlement in this case. But you're absolutely right, Sebastian Vettel, very much an emotional driver, and he's quickly become the most isolated character in Formula 1. It's quite sad that this is happening to someone of his stature. I'm going to put you on the spot here, Lee, because obviously I've asked this question a few times and had my own opinions, but given the news and rumours going around the paddock about Sebastian Vettel and Racing Point, which will become Aston Martin, of course, over the weekend there was talk about Sebastian going for a little drive with Otmar Zafna. It's having a look at his Ferrari over whether to get some gas or fuel, if you like, which the Racing Point factory in Brackley has fuel pumps there. Do you think that Sebastian Vettel will be joining Racing Point next season, of course, which will become Aston Martin?
I would say there's a very good chance of him joining Racing Point. What he needs is going to be a loving, supporting environment to recapture his speed. I mean, in his early days at Ferrari, he did some amazing drives compared to the Mercedes and how it was at the time. And he potentially missed his opportunities in the 2 seasons where Ferrari were faster than Mercedes. But going to Racing Point, if they Racing Point have been a great little family team. Obviously under the new management and the new structure, as long as they can support him, I think he'd be very perform quite well. But obviously, I don't think he's so keen on taking that step down into the upper midfield. Yes, Racing Point are a faster car this year. Obviously, the Pink Mercedes, as it's been nicknamed in the paddock, but they're not Ferrari, you could argue, is not top 3 this year, but they're not a top team as of yet. So it's if he wants to take that step down, like you look at Lewis Hamilton when he left McLaren. Mercedes were a midfield team, and maybe in 2012 McLaren had the top performing car along with Red Bull, but their prior years McLaren wasn't, and he made the decision to go into midfield. Daniel Ricciardo left Red Bull to go to Renault, and Renault is a midfield. So it's if Sebastian Vettel wants that challenge of going into the midfield with the opportunity to come back. I think he'd much rather get his hands on Mercedes, which obviously is not going to happen, or even happily go back to Red Bull, which probably won't happen. So yeah, it's going to be a very much watch this space, because even if Sebastian goes to Racing Point, yes, you got the family connections with Lawrence and Lance, but you could argue that out of the options available for Racing Point, Lance is probably the worst driver available. So what combination do you put with Sebastian? Does family loyalty come into it? So it's a very interesting situation that Racing Point could find themselves in.
Yeah, it's an exciting one, but of course not an easy one for them to be in right now. So I think it's probably a good opportunity to take a break from this one. So we're going to come back for the second part of the podcast, guys. We're going to talk about Racing Point, of course, their race, how that unfolded, the return of Nico Hülkenberg finally getting his first race under his belt following his dismissal from the Renault team last season in the place of Sergio Perez, who once again tested positive for COVID after serving the quarantine period last week. And of course, we're going to be talking about the fallout from the decision from the stewards regarding Racing Point. And of course, we'll be talking about the Concord Agreement, Mercedes controversy, and previewing the Spanish Grand Prix in part 2. So in the meantime, guys, if you are watching this podcast on the YouTube channel, that's DNF1-F1 podcast, then in the break between the two parts, there'll be a little sneak preview to a video that we've got coming on Friday. This will be the second part to the DNF1 Beginner's Guide, so make sure to have a quick look at that just to get your appetite going for that video next week. And in the meantime, we will see you in part 2 of the DNF1 F1 podcast. So welcome back to the second part of the DNF1 F1 podcast. And of course, just a reminder to you guys that are new to this, if you're listening to us on your favourite podcasting platform, We have a YouTube channel that's DNF1-F1 podcast. You can see some great videos of all of our podcasts and some other videos that we have. Of course, our part 1 of our beginner's guide and part 2, which will come out on Friday. And of course, if you do watch us on YouTube, you can listen to these podcasts on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, and many, many more. Just type in DNF1 F1 podcast. And of course, you can follow us on social media as well, on Twitter, DNF1_podcast, and on Instagram, DNF1_podcast as well. Particularly the Instagram one, because it has a lot of great content which you can get engaged in as well. So make sure to like, share, and follow us as well. So moving on to the next part of this podcast, guys. Of course, we've analysed the race and what we thought about it for the top 3 teams in the championship, although Ferrari arguably having the 5th or 6th fastest car at times, but nonetheless still one of the big 3. Let's move on to the team that has basically caused the most controversy, I'd say, in the 2020 season, giving us the most to talk about, is Racing Point, otherwise can be known as the Pink Mercedes, or Tracing Point as often a fan favourite nickname for them. But of course, another strongish race for them today, finishing in 6th and 7th place respectively for Lance Stroll and of course Nico Hülkenberg. Nico's first race back since obviously he was around last week, but he was not able to start the race, but he was able to start this one. And I think it's fair to say, Lee, Nico Hülkenberg did an absolute stellar job, if it wasn't for the fact that he was complaining with tyre vibrations at the end that they had to pit him from 5th, which relegated him to 7th. But otherwise, not the podium I think a lot of us purists would have wanted to see, but an otherwise impressive performance on his return for Nico Hülkenberg. Didn't look like he'd missed a trick.
Oh no, Nico Hülkenberg has always been a good calibre driver. I mean, you look at some of his standout performances when he got pole position with Williams that long time ago. I can't remember the exact year that was, but I remember it. So he's always had a good bucket of skill, and coming back in to a sport, apart from the fitness level, which I'm sure he hasn't been keeping up to the calibre requires for a Formula 1 driver. He's still probably a lot fitter than I am, but I'm sure he dialed it back a little bit and gave him a bit of room to have some treats and eat a bit more too, because he didn't have to worry about his weight as much.
Well, pastries was his poison, as he said.
Yeah, he loves his pastries.
Loves his pastries, yeah.
So I'm sure he probably wasn't as light as he would have liked to for a Formula 1 drive, but as you said, he wasn't expecting to be racing this year. But to come back in, I know it was such a disappointment of last week, but to come back in this weekend, get a 3rd on the grid and qualifying. And I mean, just imagine how different the race could have been if Verstappen hadn't got Hülkenberg off the line. Which, as you just said, I would have loved for Hülkenberg to get that podium and end his whole career statistic of not having a podium. But that's a different discussion. But yeah, it's a solid result for the Racing Point, and it was a shame for his tyre vibrations, because it would have been a nice solid result to finish ahead of Lance and be like, look, I've come back from nowhere and I've beaten your permanent driver. Which you could still argue that, but at the end of the day, results doesn't lie. But it was a solid result, and they've gone from 6th in the constructors back to 5th and taking over Renault after they've had their points deduction. So it was a very interesting result.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. Nico Hülkenberg, all weekend long, was on the pace. Last weekend, he was adjusting to a point where he was fairly close to Lance Stroll's pace, but then he was much faster than him this week. Of course, qualifying in 3rd position, brilliantly done in the Racing Point. Of course, got taken over on the line by Max Verstappen, who went on to win the race. So, very interesting turn of events that turned out to be for both of them. But again, an impressive drive from Nico. As I said, been out of the car for a long time, not had much time at all. Of course, this week would have done a lot more simulator work, of course, in preparation, in case Sergio Perez had recovered. Of course, Sergio Perez completing his required mandatory quarantine period. Unfortunately for him, though, he did have another test on Thursday evening, which came back positive, so the virus was still present in his body. And imagine how strict these tests probably are. Very unfortunate for Sergio Perez to come all the way for nothing, really, in Britain, but safety first, and hopefully wish him the best, and maybe he'll be back for the Spanish Grand Prix this weekend. But moving on with Racing Point, we have to talk about what you pointed out was the points deduction, and that was in reference to the protest. That's the decision finally made. The stewards made a decision on the protest, so we cast our minds back a few weeks to the Hungarian Grand Prix, the follow-up from that, or probably the Styrian Grand Prix, actually, I should say, as well, where Renault had put in a formal protest over the legality of the Racing Point, the RP20, bearing a very similar resemblance, if not canny, copycat, if you like, of the Mercedes W10 from last season. And basically, Renault were protesting over whether or not the brake ducts that the Racing Point were using were of their own intellectual property. And by that I mean, did they design them themselves, or were they purchased as an unlisted part? Now, of course, the rules had changed a lot between 2019 and 2020 over what was a listed and what was an unlisted part. The brake ducts were a listed part in 2019, but of course, that has changed. Now they are no longer a listed part in 2020. And basically, the fault that the stewards had found with Racing Point was that the rear brake ducts on the Racing Point were not a part that they believed that they had designed themselves. Those were a part that they admitted themselves they purchased from Mercedes in 2019, but didn't put them onto the 2019 car, and unlike the front brake ducts. And this is where they come unstuck, Racing Point, with their appeal, if you like, or the decision making, where if they had run this particular brake duct on the rear in 2019, they would have gone away with it, but they didn't. So therefore it was deemed that they did not design this part on their own. This was based on nothing more than the brake ducts that Mercedes had supplied for them. Of course, Mercedes have been cleared of any wrongdoing in this case, but as a result, they were fined €200,000 for each car, and which is 400,000, of course, running two cars, and 7.5 construction championship points on each car as well. So losing 15 points in the process. This, of course, will be appealed. Racing Point have appealed, and of course, they want this penalty removed. They think it's not fair. But of course, other teams have appealed because they don't think the decision was harsh enough. So Ferrari, Renault, McLaren, and Williams as well, which was a bit of a surprise given the relationship Racing Point have with Mercedes, similar to Williams and Mercedes, and Williams has decided to stand their ground. Now, what do you make of that, Lee? Do you think the penalty is fair and justified, or do you think perhaps that the FIA have not been harsh enough on Racing Point? Do you think they've let them get away with this one?
Well, firstly, I want to point out that I was reading after the race, the Racing Point had been called to the stewards regarding the use of the same brake ducts.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not sure where that has got to, but I was being aware that the stewards had summoned a representative from Racing Point because they've been using I'm not going to call it an illegal part, but the part in question
for this race.
Just after the race being gone.
Yeah.
So my personal opinion is I definitely agree it was unsportsmanly. But because it was acquired in an unsportsmanly manner, they should remove the part. Yes, you can't unlearn something that the team has learned. So there is that question of, well, they're just going to build it again as the same design. So it just throws a big spanner in the works of what Racing Point can do and what the FIA can do. However, they have to do a very fine line, similar to what they've ever done now. We'll do a little slap in the wrist, and they're hoping it goes away, a bit like the Ferrari engine situation. Or they're going to have to throw the rule book at Racing Point. Worst case, it will result in a lost constructor points or disqualification, which I think is a bit drastic, but I think the competitive teams that are appealing would love to have Racing Point disqualified from the Constructors' Championship this year, especially like the independents of Williams and McLaren, who make all their own parts. They don't want a copycat car because that A is competition, but B, it goes against how the independents work and make their own parts. I don't buy anything from the other teams. Obviously, the manufacturer of the engines, they have to buy that because they don't make their own engines. But yeah, it's just the interesting situation that it's going to probably rumble on for several months because if it goes to the Court of Appeal, you're going to have a hearing in Paris, and then that's going to obviously go on a lot longer, and there's still a decision. So I wouldn't be surprised knowing the FIA and how Formula One loves its dubious rulings that we could still be talking about this in a couple of months.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And for those of you in the background hearing an ice cream van going by playing the football anthem, well, it's summertime, it's hot 30 in the UK, and you're always going to get ice cream vans coming around in this weather. It's probably a nice idea in these conditions, but nonetheless, we've got a podcast to record, so we'll have to put that to one side for now. But you're right to point out about Racing Point, and obviously I've just been having a look through social media about what you mentioned after the race where Racing Point was summoned to the stewards. Now, I'm just reading up on this, and it's not a surprise to see this, but basically they've been summoned to the stewards to be reprimanded for continuing to use the brake ducts. Now, in the official press release that the FIA put out, the stewards put out on this, Racing Point were reminded that they would be reprimanded for each race that they continue to use these brake ducts. So they've received their penalty. They've been found to have done wrong in this context by the FIA and the stewards, but unfortunately, this cannot prevent them from continuing to use these parts, because it's not like saying we take that part away from you. What's to stop Racing Point designing another brake duct exactly the same? Even if they've been found to use intellectual property belonging to others, you can't forget what you know. So in this context, Racing Point have managed to get around it, and they will not be punished, at least on a physical level, or losing any further points or fines for continuing to use these brake ducts. So they're effectively using what you would consider an illegal part in this context, to a point where the FIA can't do nothing more than issue them a reprimand. And I think that's where the other teams, like we mentioned Renault, Ferrari, Red Bull mentioned their support for it, but they decided not to formally appeal because they knew that everyone else was going to appeal anyway, so it didn't matter. So you get that situation. As a fan, I don't want to see this. Obviously, I want to see the best teams, and teams like Racing Point have been very well known for developing excellent cars under limited budget constraints, which of course will be playing into their favour once the budget cap comes into effect in a few years' time with the new cars. But it's always been this debate whether or not using the listed parts, like Haas often did with Ferrari and Alfa Romeo in the past, which was legal then, as controversial it was, that was proved to be legal under the rules. In this case, the reason why Racing Point are not being considered for a disqualification is because they were in breach of sporting regulations rather than technical. If it was a breach of technical regulations, then they would potentially be on grounds for disqualification. So that's kind of where we are there. But as I said before, it kind of leaves a sour taste, because what this means now is the FIA have basically admitted that they've made mistakes in this. Nicholas Tambasis, who's the head of single-seater operations and basically the referee of Formula One, if you like, and when he went to visit all the teams, and I should clarify, guys, for those of you that don't know the process, before the season starts, Nicholas Tambasis in this case will go to visit all of the teams, check through all of the blueprints, the schematics of all the cars to make sure that everything that they are putting on that car that is not a listed part is designed at home by them, or at least through an external supplier that isn't another team. You basically can't buy these bits from other teams. And he said quite often that the brake ducts were not an area that they had checked, owing to the transition between 1920 them being listed or non-listed parts. Basically, they were under the assumption that if Racing Point were going to use these brake ducts, they would have used them on last year's car. But they didn't check. And that kind of opens up scrutiny to their own process or policing of these rules. So they've brought in the rule change for next season that this sort of thing that Racing Point have done will not be allowed. No teams will be allowed to do that, which that's great for next year, but it still means Racing Point can carry on with their advantage. So to move on from that, Racing Point have put their appeal on, and on the grounds that they are of the opinion that they've done nothing wrong. Otmar Zafner, the team principal, and Lawrence Stroll, who doesn't do many interviews, Lawrence Stroll, but he did today, came out emphatically on Sky Sports and told them that we operated within the rules that the FI and the stewards gave us. They visited us and they basically gave our car a clean bill of health. Now, on that prognosis, Lee, and their appeal, would you be surprised with that reasoning alone that Racing Point could get away with this and have their penalty overturned? because the FIA have failed to carry out their due diligence, as we've mentioned already.
Yeah, I mean, there's a quite good possibility of Racing Point getting the decision overturned. But if the decision was overturned, I'm sure the teams that are currently appealing it will appeal that decision, and then it will just keep going. The situation will just keep going throughout the course of the year until there is a final ruling in the FIA court. It's the only way it's going to end up being resolved one way or another. Because one team won't like it, so that in one instance Racing Point will appeal, or if Racing Point gets something they're happy with, the other teams will appeal because they're not happy with it. So it's above the steward's decision now. It's just down to, as you said, the sporting regulations and how it's going to be interpreted eventually, in my opinion, in the FIA courts.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. And I think that brings us also to the news about Mercedes on their reaction to, or their negotiations, if you like, with the Concord Agreement. Now, the Concord Agreement, in short, is a simple agreement that all the teams have to sign up to basically agree with the rules and regulations that are going to be put in place and to commit themselves to driving in Formula 1. Now, of course, Mercedes aren't happy over a few terms in that contract, and Toto Wolff was very, very adamant that Mercedes were not given the respect that they deserve in these negotiations. I mean, we're talking about a team for the last 6-7 years that has dominated Formula 1, has been the lead runners in Formula 1, if you like. They've got the most famous driver, they've got the best driver, they've got 6 championships in a row, possibly 7 this year on both drivers and constructors fronts, most likely the latter, definitely. And just a few things I'm going to raise here. Now, people that listen to this podcast will know that I try to stay impartial, and I do feel that I'm impartial on these podcasts, even though I am a Ferrari fan. But Ferrari have managed to maintain the veto on rule changes. Basically means that if there are certain rule changes they're not happy with, they can offer their veto and get it removed if they wish, or at the very least get it negotiated more in their favour. And they're also able to retain the historic payment bonus that they receive. It's around about £40 million or dollars, I think, every year. I'm not quite sure on the currency, but it's about 40 million every year for their historical contribution to the Formula 1 Championship. Now, Ferrari are the oldest team in the sport. They've almost done 1,000 races. I believe the 1,000th race will be at Mugello for them. If I'm right, I think they're up to 996 now, so I think it will be Mugello where they have their 1,000th race. So what's your take on that? Because, of course, the Concord Agreement has to be finalised and signed off by all the teams on the 12th of August. I believe Mercedes and Toto Wolff are the only ones that haven't. Do you think there's much room or time for things to change on that front? Or do you think Toto Wolff is just expressing a bit of frustration over the fact that he is protecting his team's advantage that they've worked so hard to build up? What's your take on that?
I think the deadline is Wednesday, I believe. Please correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, 12th of August, so yeah, it will be Wednesday.
So there isn't much time for further negotiations. But when Toto Wolff has to obviously play his bit to the board of directors down there, we're Ferrari getting this, we're not getting that. So he's got to do his bit to at least show to his bosses he's representing their interests. So I think that's part of the talk. If Mercedes get anything is a different matter, but he's got to vocalise that aspect. And secondly, because Mercedes, as you said, that they've been the best team since the hybrid era, I should say. But at the same time, they have been a manufacturer of engines since the 90s. And really, I'm not too sure when they left the sport in the early 50s. I can't remember the exact year they came back into the sport. So they haven't, obviously, as you said, they haven't been around for the longevity of Ferrari. Although they were back in the 50s and they're here now. But at the same time, the FIA and Liberty won't want Mercedes to walk away from the sport, which admittedly Toto Wolff hasn't threatened, but there's been these rumours persisting probably since the beginning of the year that Mercedes are going to walk away from the sport. I don't think they're going to walk away from the sport because they've got contracts in place with teams to provide engines and they've just signed Valtteri Bottas for next year. So, but there's still another aspect that Mercedes could throw. What I reckon will probably happen is Mercedes will probably end up getting a little bit more extra money. Maybe not the 40 million that Ferrari are getting, but they'll get something that Toto will go, okay, yeah, we're happy with that, and he can go, look, go back to his boss and go, look, we won, we got something. That's what I think is going to happen. To be honest, I do think Mercedes will end up signing, but there will be a last movement.
Yeah, it's similar hallmarks to what Ferrari so often did with these Concord agreements over rule changes, threatening to pull out and stuff. And of course, no one really took them seriously to a degree. But of course, Toto Wolff probably just protecting his advantage. Of course, Mercedes have worked so hard to get this advantage that they've enjoyed for quite some time now. And of course, like Ferrari before them, they want to do what they can to protect that. So, as I said, I don't expect any major headlines saying Mercedes are pulling out of Formula 1 on Tuesday or anything like that. But of course, these sorts of things happen. It's perfectly normal. And as you pointed out, that Mercedes probably will get some compensation, or even if not, there's probably no reason for them to not want to stay on. So we'll move on with that one and look out for that news on Tuesday. So for the last part of the podcast, and just a quick mention, apologies for those of you that are hearing some background music or background sounds at the moment. As I said before, our recording situation for the little while has not been ideal, but we'll persevere nonetheless. And of course, for those of you that are hearing music, wondering what that is, I'm not sure the song, but my neighbours are out there having a good time in the sun, having a nice barbecue and enjoying themselves. So lovely weather for that sort of thing. I did that a little bit earlier on and last weekend, but back in the studio recording the podcast. Anyway, move on to the final part of this episode, guys, and that's the preview, of course, for next week's Spanish Grand Prix. So the third race in our triple header before we have a little break, Spanish Grand Prix at Barcelona, where of course the scene where we had our pre-season testing earlier on in February. It feels so long ago when we were recording episodes for that, when we first started this podcast on pre-season testing. But here we are, coming back to Barcelona. There were doubts over whether this race was going to go ahead over into their situation regarding COVID, but the race is going ahead. And Lee, what are your thoughts on the Spanish Grand Prix? Are we going to see another race potentially where Red Bull could upset the upper echelons of the grid with Mercedes dominance? Or do you feel that Mercedes will go back to winning ways? Because it's been a circuit in the past that has suited Mercedes more than others. And do you feel Mercedes perhaps will relish on righting their wrongs for today and taking advantage of that?
Firstly, to answer your first point, it's August, and Barcelona in August is not cold.
Well, you've just come back, haven't you, from Madrid? So yes, you would know.
Even when there's bad weather in Barcelona in August, it'd be wet, but it'll still be warm. Maybe not air temperature of the mid-30s or higher, and the real pool temperatures into the 40s, but the tarmac and the track, I should say, will retain a lot of the heat, because if there is a shower, just talking from my experience of experiencing bad weather in August in Barcelona, the shower, a couple of hours and it's past. It's not like it is here in the UK where you get some rain and it's a day, 2 days. It's a couple of hours and it's gone. Very heavy. Well, you could describe it as tropical rain. It's short, sharp, and over with. So if there is bad weather, it won't last very long. And the track will retain a lot of the heat. So like today, I'm sure it's going to be very hot and sunny in Barcelona, which will play, I think, into Red Bull's favour. And obviously, depending on the air pressure of the tyres, if Pirelli are going to keep the air pressures high, it could obviously hinder Mercedes again this weekend. So I think into next weekend, we could be looking at probably a Mercedes front row. I don't think that's going to be really any question. Obviously, the order of who's first and second is a different matter. But I wouldn't be surprised if you're looking at Verstappen on the second row, probably very similar to how this weekend started But Red Bull will be going into that race thinking we can get them again. We've done it last week. We can do it this week. It's going to be hot. Mercedes may struggle on their tyres. We're going to be there. As you said about the track itself, Mercedes, I know from what you can witness about how Mercedes operate, the team are going to want to come back with a vengeance. Lewis, all right, will want to come back to win the race. He doesn't like losing, but I think that's through Mercedes as a whole, and I'm sure Barcelona doesn't like losing either. So both drivers will have a point to prove. So they want to come back strong. But it's going to be a very interesting situation regarding the tyres. And I hate when the Formula 1 comes down talking about the tyres, but I think that's what it's going to be about, is if Mercedes chew their tyres or not. That's the real question for next week.
Yeah, it's certainly been the deciding factor this season, where tyre life and tyre durability has played havoc in the last few races, and it looks like it may become a factor again. Of course, there's only going to be one race at Barcelona, the Circuit de Catalunya, where we had our pre-season testing, and the teams will be finely tuned. They'll know a lot about the circuit. They'll have more data probably there than there will almost any other track. So it's definitely going to be a circuit where you may find a lot more predictability in the pecking order than other circuits. Just looking at the weather, it's going to be hot and sunny all weekend by the looks of it next week in Barcelona. 28, 29, 28 for Friday, Saturday, Sunday respectively. So fairly consistent temperatures, and you're rightly, it could point to another difficult weekend if Mercedes chew up their tyres, as you say, and have problems with looking after them. It may be another opportunity for Red Bull to really take advantage. Max Verstappen, of course, his first win for Red Bull came at the Circuit de Catalunya on his debut for the team back in 2016, and I'm sure he'll be planning to hopefully repeat that feat. And certainly, why not? After a day like today, I think if there's a circuit that Mercedes probably would like to go to after today, it's probably Barcelona. But then for the same reason, it could play into Red Bull's hands as well. So I'm hoping it will provide another excellent showing as we've seen today. But it could also be another track that Racing Point might actually be very, very strong at, because they were very quick in pre-season testing. It's where we kind of first saw the early hallmarks of that car, which looked impressive, where we might thought that they were ready to challenge the big three, or at least Ferrari in particular. We know that they're doing that now anyway, but Racing Point still haven't managed to get onto the podium yet this season, I believe. So it will be an opportunity for them to try and see if they can put that right, and perhaps there. But Lee, I'm going to put you on the spot, because as we're running short of time, what do you think your top three is going to be in Barcelona next week?
Oh, it's such a tough one. But I would say I think Verstappen for the win next week. As much as I don't like that, but I think he can win that, and I'll then say it's probably going to be a Hamilton Bottas, similar results to today.
Yeah, I'm going to go a little bit different and be a bit more traditional and go Hamilton, Bottas, Verstappen. I think the strategy, Red Bull will try something a bit audacious again, as they so often do with a gamble like that, to upset the odds, but I think Mercedes may see that coming, and they may take measures to return to form. Remember, we're not going for uber soft compounds. They're going to be a lot more conservative on tyres, which will probably suit Mercedes a lot more than they have this week. But nonetheless, I think that's probably coming towards the end of the podcast now. Been going on for about an hour. I mean, it's funny, Lee, I so often say on this podcast, as much as I do these shows with Courtney, and he offers a lot as a co-host as well, but I think it's fair to say as well with you that we could probably go on for hours and hours and hours talking about this sort of stuff, but we obviously got to be mindful of time nonetheless. But nonetheless, thank you very, very much for coming on, Lee. It's been a pleasure having you on the show, and hopefully we'll have you on for many more episodes in the future this season.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me.
And all that's left to say, guys, is thank you very, very much for tuning into this episode of the DNF1 podcast. If you enjoyed it, make sure to like, share and subscribe if you listen to us on YouTube, on our channel DNF1-F1 podcast. And if you listen to us on Spotify, iTunes, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, thank you so much as well. Just a little announcement, of course, thank you guys that have supported us on the latter mentioned podcasting platforms. We reached our first big milestone of over 500 downloads on those platforms, not including YouTube. So thank you very, very much for everyone that has downloaded, listened to an episode of the DNF1 F1 podcast. We want to thank you so much for your support, and we will be hoping to bring you more content in the near future. And of course, the last thing that's left to say, of course, is to make sure to check out the part 2 video, the DNF1 Beginner's Guide to Formula 1, that is coming out live on Friday on the YouTube channel, DNF1-F1 podcast. Make sure to set your notifications on for that video. It's going to be great. I've been working really hard on that, and I'm really looking forward to you guys letting me know what you think, as the first one has done so well. In the meantime, all that's left to say is thank you very much for listening to another episode of DNF1 F1 podcast. Make sure to like, share, subscribe as mentioned already, and enjoy the hot weather wherever you are around the world. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we will see you in the next DNF1 F1 podcast. Goodbye.